doing?
We're going right into friends.
Just check. Oh my word, it's a microphone. Hi, I get to talk to a bunch of writers. This is so scary for me. Anybody out there also afraid of public speaking like this? Yeah, well, you're my support system, please. These two people I'm with, they're just amazing authors, and they have no problem. I've had their problems, so thank you. Welcome to Researching History for Your Stories. In this session, we're going to show you how to incorporate history into your novels to improve your story, your character, and your story, character, settings. Every story comes from human experience. Every character possesses a biography, and every setting, the best settings, have already been constructed. So you simply have to know where to find them, and that's what we're going to try to show you today. The different ways you can use history, no matter what you write. You write the past influences everything you write, whether it's romance, military, science fiction, historical, contemporary, futuristic. It all depends on the layers of information you want to give to your readers. We'll cover 8 topics tonight. We're going to cover people, places, events, language, modern morality, criticism, research, and rabbit holes. And now let's yeah, really. And now let's go exploring and see if using history can enhance your writing. And I am proud to be joined by 2 amazing novelists, Jenny and RJ, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves.
All right. I'm Jenny Madore. I write as J.L. Madore. I write sexy romance. And then I also write fantasy and academy as Auburn Tempest. In my series that we're going to be talking about today is about a modern Toronto girl who time slips back into ancient Pompeii. So it's set in 79 AD, and it is like a trilogy that covers the eruption of Vesuvius, and then the opening of the Colosseum, and then the death of Emperor Titus. So all based in history. And so yeah, there's a lot of research to do for that.
I'm RJ. I write urban fantasy and other speculative fiction. I also write contemporary romantic comedy. Mostly today I'm going to be talking about 2 series. My magical romantic comedy with the body count series takes myth, legend, lore, history from all around the world, tosses it together, adds some magic, and gives it a good shake. And basically nothing is safe. And my other series is called Seeking the Zodiacs, and I change the world timeline at World War II and rewrite history up to modern times.
Good. And I'm Clifton Slater, and my historical adventure series is the Blain Warrior Stories. It's a 9-book series that follows a young, hot-headed legionnaire through 265 BC up through the First Punic War. Okay, we talked about the topics. Topic number 1, people. When researching history, we read about real people. How do you mix real or mythical figures with your historical characters? Jenny?
Well, I was actually kind of really lucky because I picked Pompeii because of the ash of Vesuvius. A lot of Pompeii and Herculaneum was preserved. So whereas a lot of people had to do like a huge amount of digging, there's a lot of historical reference to what life in ancient Pompeii was like and the records of the people. So when I talked about the magistrates and Emperor Titus and his brothers, and I did talk about Pliny the Younger and a few of the other men there, all of that is like recorded things that have actually survived history. So I was not really cheating, but there was a lot more there than a lot of people have. So I was happy to be able to access that. And then what I did is I just put a modern girl into that scenario, so it would show the contrast of the sexists of the time, the upper echelons of the time, and again give me all the conflicts that I needed through that. But I left the historical characters as they were.
Well, I'm probably the black sheep here. I start with a myth or a legend and a culture I like. I research the myth, the legend, or the culture, and I learn how do these people tick. I don't start with the individual. I start the circumstances of how that individual came to be. So when I'm doing my research, I'm looking more at the whole picture rather than the individual picture. And as I continue my research, I'm like, oh, this person's really cool. How did that person get to be where they were at the time they made history? So when I create characters or I take spin-offs of characters because I create my own timelines, I look at the circumstances of what made someone make history, and then I use that in my books, using them as a model, but hardly ever actually using those specific people. I do use them sometimes, but I find the speculative part of it being, well, what would happen if? And then I create a character based on history, based on research, but is their own individual. And then I make them change the world.
My main character is Alero Cicera, and he is a powerful senator as a patron. And I selected a real Roman senator from that era because he was a successful general and a political force. Through that character, the real character, my character gets to experience the political intrigue of the day. And that adds to what's going on, and this allows me to tell the readers about current events without having to do a monologue or even a pre-setup of what to expect in that. So our takeaway from historical people is this. You can see historical people can be major characters, minor characters, or simply ideas that launch your characters into different worlds. Topic number 2, places. Every story is set in a location, be it a castle, a city, or region. The setting is the place where our characters play. How do you research and use characters, Jenny?
Well, my primary research started on the internet. So I wanted to find, well, it did. I wanted to find a place, a timeline where I could get 3 consecutive books with 3 things that happened that people would recognize historically. And then from there, when I decided on Pompeii, the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto had an incredible, just one of those traveling display things when they come in, and it just so happened that it was Pompeii, and I went to that several times, and then my bestie went to Pompeii at the same time, and she brought me back books and things that I could use for reference. And yeah, so like I said, I was fairly lucky because Pompeii is something that you can find a lot of information about, and between, you know, the internet, Royal Ontario Museum, and then I started using sites like National Geographic and like really reputable places where you can trust what they're saying, and I went that route.
Most of my stories take place in the United States, but my mother, so it started really early. My mother was, or she still is, a geek about the American Revolution. To the point she's written several books. She's an expert in things like the little buttons and the bullets. She's done a lot of work building knowledge. So I grew up with that sense of, you need to know your research to be able to do these things. And so as I grew older and started to write, I kind of started just taking that and going, well, okay, if I want to become an expert in this, I need to know this, 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 and that. In locations, I like going to locations. I traveled extensively as a child, mostly to battlegrounds, which is kind of weird when you're a kid. But nowadays, if I can go somewhere to research, I will. Earlier this year. Earlier this year. Time is weird. So we went to Europe. We went to England to go to all the historic sites. My husband and I are time team geeks. We love British archaeology. We watch this show, hundreds of hours of watching this show. But if you want to learn about British history, Time Team is amazing. You get to see these locations, you get to see them through the days, you learn about how history happened. And so we went to England and we went to our favorite sites from the show to see it up close and personal. And that goes back into my writing because there's nothing quite like going to a site and seeing this is what happened after this. And you get a bigger understanding of how time decays history. And then when you were writing it in a book, you have to go, how do I transport the readers to those moments before it started to decay? And you're capturing those little moments in history, like at Hadrian's Wall. When you go to the wall, you'll see just the crumbling ruins, but they actually, in their introduction to it, show overlays of how it should have looked when it was new. And you start to understand, this is the history that made this. And there were steps between them. And then you implement that in your writing because Your story isn't just in the moment. It's a collision of what happened in the past, what's happening now in the story, and what will happen in the future. And you can't make the story work unless you put all of that together. The characters are full of history. If you don't know how to research history, you can't make those characters come to life. They're not these 2D things that you just go, oh, well, they're like this. They have a history. When you put your research into your book, your characters are part of that history. And as you research, you'll start to see, because this happened in history, this character can be how he or she is now. So when you're researching, don't just put it in the fact. Think about the people behind how those facts came to be. And always remember, history is the view of the victor. What happened to the losers in history? That's where the real stories are. And if you learn about what happened to the losers in history, you can then really start building a story.
Well, the losers in history for 1,000 years ran up against the Legion. It didn't work out well for them. The First Punic War started when the legions for the first time crossed a major body of water. They crossed the Messina Strait. Messina Strait separates Sicily from the rest of Italy. Messina Strait is an extreme current event. Every 6 hours, the current reverses. Days of rowing and sailing ships, that was so hazardous for the ships trying to do it. To add to the problem, in 264 BC, the straits were guarded by the powerful Carthage navy. And then in 1908, everything along the coastline of the Messina Strait in an earthquake sank into the water. So the towns, the ruins, the ports, everything that was there in the period I'm writing in, gone. So I had to do is take Google Maps and research what was still remaining up on the hills and try to decipher where the tower would have been, where the city would have been. The city may be there now, but it's way back off. So all of that allows me to take a Google map and draw in where I think they are. And from that, I can research a place, and it's just a fascinating place. So our takeaway is, as we demonstrated, place could be a background, place could be a specific setting for your characters, or place can be features that interact with your characters. Topic number 3, events. Historical fiction is telling a small story set in a bigger story of the day. Do you stay in the era, use events as framework, and veer off, or do you use events for history to enhance your story? Jenny?
Well, for this book, for the first book, the historical event it's the pivotal climax of the book. So Danica gets thrown back in time, and she's a relic thief. She touches a coin and is thrown back into ancient Pompeii. But she's a history buff, so she knows that she's just weeks away from Pompeii being covered in ash, and she knows that she needs to either get out of there or help them get out of there. But being a female, no one will listen to her. And when she's trying to explain what's about to happen, then she's cited as an alarmist, or but she's a white-faced girl who has outspoken tendencies. So yes, getting back, I'm wandering. So yes, so the event is that she knows that it's coming, and it is the pivotal point. So she has to decide where she's going to be and whatnot. So it's a huge part of the book. And then I wrapped the story in and around that event.
I typically use history to enhance my stories, although in a couple of upcoming books, particularly Outfoxed, which is a rewritten United States Magic Floods the World, but it happens in recent enough times where I have to account for modern technology in a world that is now magical and turned dystopian. So history is always present, and I will go back into the past to find new and interesting things to do in the future. But honestly, if I want to have the most fun, I write an archaeologist, and I completely rewrite history as it's happening. I have a vampire archaeologist book I'm currently working on called Neck Deep, and it is about a woman from Napoleon's era who finds basically the fountain of youth through vampirism, and it starts out with the mummy's curse. And so to do this, I had to look up Napoleon, because Napoleon did invade Egypt, and at the time of the Rosetta Stone being found. And then I had to see, okay, what can I do without actually disrupting this timeline, because I cannot disrupt it in this specific book. The disruptions happen later. So I had to integrate this character and magic without history being changed at all. So I had to be very careful. So secret society, secret magic, secret everything. Nobody wants anybody to know anything is weird. And that makes it a real big challenge, because when you're going through history, you have to follow every culture's history and see how they clash, interact, and how this character goes from Napoleon's Egypt to today. And how do I make her disappear in and out of the system? Because once records were recorded, they would notice she's not aging. So she has to disappear and reappear and manipulate the entire system. So history becomes my guide map, and it's a curse, because I have to play by those rules, or the readers will not buy into when I break the rules. So when you're doing research, the most important thing you need to remember is you must be in full control of when you break the rules, and you must be able to justify it to your readers. If you can't justify your rule breaking to your readers, you've lost them. They won't trust you for when you do the real important changes to your world. So be really careful with your research, keep good notes, and most importantly, when you're using history, make sure you respect the cultures that those histories come from. Egyptians have a very different view of life than Americans do. And when you're writing about Egyptian culture, you need to completely put away your current culture. You need to go, this is not how these people behave. And then you need to, when you put it on the paper, you need to handle the history and culture with respect, because you don't know who's going to pick up your book and read it. It's one thing to add to a sad changes, but do so knowing what you're doing, knowing that if I change this, am I being respectful of that history and culture? Because that becomes a foundation of your entire book. And I think that's something that gets forgotten. I'm terrible with microphone.
In Clay Warriors, they follow the build-up to the First Punic War. I research events. I create motivations and actions when I find gaps in logic. For example, when the legions crossed the Messina Strait, they ended up between a Carthage army on one side and a Syracuse army on the other. Now, Carthage and Syracuse had a lot of tension between them, but they also had treaties between them. Both of them didn't like the idea of the Roman Republic invading Sicily. So those two armies should have crushed the legion. They could have done it easily. They didn't. For some reason, they delayed. I took that delay and I created a situation with my character, intercepted a messenger, prevented the two armies from clashing, and then the real history was they jumped over the wall, beat one army, came back, spent the night, and the next morning jumped over the other wall and beat the other army. So they waited. So our takeaway from historical events is a historical event can be the end of a story, it can be a mystery in the middle you solve, or it can be a jump-off point to launch your reader into an entirely new world. Topic number 4, language. Accents, idioms, cursing, and speech patterns change from century to century. How do you use language in your stories? Jenny?
Well, I think, yeah, this goes to all novels, and people come across all the time. Do you use the accents? Do you spell out the accents? How much of the accents do you use? And it, I think, is just generally better received if it's very sparingly done. Ancient Romans spoke Latin, so there was no direct pronouns for the most part. So now when I translate that, it becomes very jerky to the reader if I actually was trying to be historically accurate to how it would sound. So obviously I didn't do that. I've picked a couple pronouns that my main character, Quintus, when he spoke, those would be the pronouns that he dropped. So when you read it, you know it was his voice because you could hear that he spoke differently. But Danica, of course, she's a modern girl, so she's back there, and she used her own modern idioms and the way that we talk. She used modern cursing, whereas Quintus and the Praetorians, they use a very different, swearing system. And my readers, they expect a certain level of heat, a certain level of language, and so I let my warriors swear, but they swore the way they would have sworn, which is calling someone, by an unflattering animal name, or by the gods. They would use different terminologies than we would use. So Jupiter's cock and things like that, just things that would be historically accurate to the way they would speak to each other. Your brother's a pig kind of thing, and they thought that was, the most insulting thing that you could say to them. But it was just very different. But yeah, you have to be aware of how they would speak to one another.
I have a pen name, Susan Copperfield, and that whole pen name is dedicated to what happened if the United States devolved into a monarchy with a caste system, with magic, because magic's required. In The Captive King, I wrote about tribal cultures, Mesoamerican, and it involved a lot of research and history. Surprise. I specifically focused on the Maya and the Mexica. You know the Mexicas, the Aztecs. When I was going through, there's very limited information on some of these languages. They're quite dead. I have a book called The Maya Code, which goes into the Maya and their language and their culture and how their language evolved. It's one of the few older Mesoamerican languages that has a good written record. So I used this book plus going online and comparing Mexican culture with Maya culture and how they clashed, and finding a way to, using the confines of history, to meld these two cultures and have them meet in a non-violent fashion, which is a lot harder than you might think. It's they're both, the Mayan were not peaceful. Like a lot of people think they are, they're really not. They're very violent, just like the Mexico were. So I had to, in my storyline, they had a unification. There were actual sects of these tribes that got along, and they made unions. And I had to figure out how language would change if the two languages clashed. So I had to look at what we knew of the Mexican language from their origin, and then see what is the language structure. Can I make them match? They wrote in pictures more than words. So the answer is not really, but you can wing it carefully. So I had to wing it. I did use some words from Maya and from the Mexica very sparingly, because every time you use a word from an ancient culture, you have to explain the nuances of it. You can't just toss it in for flavor. Every word you introduce has a meaning that doesn't fit with our own. They have, like, marriage is not just, oh, they're married. Marriage to the Mexica was a life bond. You cheat on your partner, you are sacrificed on an altar. We don't have that same connotation in the United States. So when I brought in the words for marriage and the words for love, I had to account for the differences in our culture and their culture. So language is so important, but it's so hard to get right if you're going to include it. If you can't do it right, don't do it at all. But for cursing, I found some.
I'm not comfortable in my novels cussing. I never have been. Cursing is something that's just for me personally. However, I write about rough men that stand in shield walls inches away from people trying to kill and mutilate them. So I had a problem. They couldn't be like, oh gosh, darn, that was you stuck the gladius in my belly. It's horrible. No, so to soften remarks about body parts, body functions, and sex, I actually went and researched, and I have a whole list of Latin translation swear words in Latin. So my characters all swear in Latin, and So I'm not a Latin scholar. I know less about it than Jenny, and she's pretty amazing. But they're my books and they're my world, and that's something you can't forget. It's your books and your world. Your history is going to be influenced by how you want to put down facts. So, takeaway: language can identify a character. Language can set one group apart from the other, and language can bring realism to your work. Topic number 5: modern morality. When researching history, we read about sexism, slavery, brutality, and unfair caste systems. Do you allow your characters to make moral judgments about historical customs? Jenny?
Well, actually, that was most of my tension and obstacles in my novel, because it was Danica, modern girl, thrown back into ancient Pompeii. So Quintus's family, they owned and ran the gladiatorial barracks, and so she thought that was horrible. And you know, at one of the events they had the gladiators come, and they stood there naked while everyone walked around, and she just thought that was the most disgusting thing that she had ever seen, that everybody was pawing them and they were slaves. And so yeah, that come in my novel, that was a great way to show the differences in cultural belief systems and what is considered acceptable today versus what was done then. And because too, she was an independent female that had her own job, had her own place, lived her own life, and then she went back into ancient Pompeii, and because she wasn't married, she had no rights. Because she wasn't Roman, she had even less. So everything that she did was life or death for her, which, you know, again, the feminism, the sexism, all those things came out because she had to bite her tongue, and she had to be very careful of who she said what to and how she maneuvered the system, because it was life or death then for a female to have an opinion. Very, very wealthy women in ancient Pompeii could have a business and could have an opinion, but they were Romans. They had rights. So yeah, it was a big part of the conflict of my novel.
So this is kind of funny. Back to the Susan Copperfield books, I went to compare modern times with betrothal practices because I had reestablished monarchy and caste systems. It turns out the United States already has a betrothal system in place. It is currently in the law books. I was trying to go, well, child marriage sucks, blah, blah, except for it's completely legal in half of the United States, and I didn't have to change anything. So I went, what? So this is a case of where I was trying to use modern culture, compare it to a historical past, and got a really ugly surprise. As in some states in the United States, a parent can go in, sign the paperwork, their child has no say because the parent has legal signing rights for a child until the age of 18. They can marry the child without the child's consent. That is practice in the United States. Currently about 14,000 children a year. So as I delved deeper, I went, wow, we did this in medieval times. We're still doing it today. So it's very much, when you look into the past for history, to compare it to modern culture, sometimes you find that old practices we thought were dead or should be dead are actually alive and well. So it really changes how I view a lot of modern times, because underneath the veneer of, well, we're modern, we should be better than that, it's really, the past is integral to where we are today, and those things still exist. So my whole entire plot line that I was planning for that series kind of got kicked in the face, because there was no changes I really needed to make. I changed in Texas, I made the year of consent 1 year earlier. The rest was by the book. So as I found modern law, past times, sometimes they match. And then you have to go, culturally, how did we actually change? Did we change at all? And that can add a marvelous depth to your story. So when you do research into the past history and compare it to modern culture, track that. Has it actually changed? Have people actually changed that, or are we just thinking we have? a lot of depth and color to your characters and to the world you've created using history, modern times, and where they come from.
So I wrote about slaves taken from a defeated town up in Tuscany, which was the extent in 264 of the Roman Republic. That was as far north as they went, and they were brought to Rome, and they were forced to fight in funeral games. Now, funeral games, human blood was considered sacred. Spilling it on the gravesite helped the deceased soul go into Hades. So, good thing, right? Except these were held in a stockyard, and for the first time, the games were held as a public exhibition, 264 BC. So, for my characters, it was a novelty. They went, that's interesting. They had no objection to the spectacle because of who they are. And so, that was a gap for me that I just thought was fascinating. So, I had to put that in the book. So, our takeaway from there is when you research different times, you will encounter archaic customs. And then when you transfer that information to your story, you can choose to correct it, accept it, or fix it in your books. So what are we saying here? Can you tell me out? Okay, so we have 15. Let's do one more. Okay. Topic number 6, criticism. Readers with knowledge of your era will pick at your depiction of history or the situation you present. How do you handle criticism, Jenny?
Well, actually, I've been pretty lucky so far. My historical, I don't think I've had anybody really come back at me. Some people don't like the fact that, you know, she eventually has to support some of the gladiatorial stuff, but it worked in that story at that time. She was forced to accept some of their customs. But yeah, I think everybody's opinions are valid, and I think everybody has their own objections, and those are based in their own lives and experiences. So I just kind of take it that way. I know that my research is historically accurate, and I know I've done my very best to respect it. So I just take it as you know, one person's opinion. That's all well and good.
Usually people say they love how well researched my books are, which is great. But there are times, such as in the Royal States world, where I do broach on things like the current customs around child marriage, and they assign morality to me based off of my fiction. And that doesn't set well with me because it has nothing to do with me. My books are not me, they're researched. I do, based on research, how things would fall together. Just because an author writes something does not mean they believe what they are writing in. And I think that is the one criticism that I wish people would just go away. They won't, so I just usually bite my tongue, and every now and then I remind my readers it's fiction. I don't, what happens in my fiction is not a reflection of me as a person. Okay.
You know, I acknowledge my view of history is flawed because it comes through my stories, and I need to make an action adventure story out of it. And it can't be too long down in historical facts. They have to be there. The story has to be there. But I'm writing historical adventure, not history books. And people that are critical of me, I know why. I mix Roman legion ranks with American military ranks. For instance, to me, an NCO that handles squads is a sergeant, and a sergeant is an OPTIO. So some of the purists come down on me pretty hard. Also, when you write history, sometimes you're going to find yourself getting confused. Your readers get confused in the era. Most people write Roman legion, write 100 years later. I write Myth-Republic, not the Empire. So our takeaway from this is, as Jenny said, everyone's opinion is valid to them. If you do your research and write honestly as you can, let's face it, critical, what was that word I wrote? Yeah, cynical opinions don't have to be valid to you. So, tell them to suck it. All right, we're good. So let's go to the topic number 8. Those paying attention, we skip 7 for time. Rabbit holes. While researching for your book, you gather a lot of data. how much of the information do you actually use in your novel, Jenny?
Sadly, not nearly as much as you find. If you're doing a research project and you really love what the era that you're looking into, there are so many fascinating things and so many things you want to add in and so many things that you think everybody needs to know about your time frame and and then you get to writing it and you could just really bog down your whole story with really great stuff, but it's really only such a very small fraction. When I wrote, I knew that, the murals in the Adile's home were correct. I knew that the statue in the garden was correct. I knew all those things because I had researched them. And I put them in just as little thing, but you can't really expect the readers to know that that's correct. Maybe the people that really, really know their stuff will say, hey, that was really good. But really, you're just putting it in there for flavor. It's the spice of your novel. It's just to set the tone and to show them that you've really taken it seriously and really respect what you've researched. But sadly, not nearly as much stuff as you find interesting.
I would say only 1 to 5% of what I research actually makes it into the book. But here's the deal. That remaining 95% that didn't make it into the book is actually the foundation of understanding, so you know enough to actually write that 1 to 5%. So be patient with yourself. You do have to do a lot of learning to be able to use any of these glorious tidbits you may find. Rabbit holes are dangerous. I have gone looking for things on World War II and ended up in medieval era and how people stabbed each other with swords, because in World War I they were still stabbing each other with swords. And well, World War II obviously, related to World War I, and the rabbit holes can get very deep very quickly. So you do have to research with a purpose. But have fun with it. You're only going to use a small fraction of what you actually learn, but that learning becomes a foundation for the future. And you'll find you're doing less research because you've already learned 25% from this previous research expedition. You can just refresh your knowledge and then move on. So it builds. It's a cup you keep filling, and it never runs out of space for more stuff. But record it. Record what you research. Put it in a binder. Put it on your computer. Make a list of URLs you visited that you found were accurate and good. You don't want to have to research your research. So try to make those rabbit holes count. So when you go off on a tangent, make that tangent worthwhile. If you find you're not getting anything out of it, put the brakes on, go back to what you're doing, and do it right. So rabbit holes are fun, but make sure you are rabbit holing into something useful.
Bernard Cornwell, who's my favorite historical fiction writer, says he does extensive research but only uses about 10% for his novels. I think I'm a little heavier than that, but I love my research. As a matter of fact, rabbit holes, one of my favorite rabbit holes I went down was felt. Felt is waterproof, it's warm, it's the oldest cloth known to man. And while it's found in ancient civilizations in various places around the world, felt wasn't used by every civilization. In order to make felt, you had to have fur or hair that had interlock on a molecular level. So some of the plains of Native American Plains Indians did not have felt, yet the ones in the mountains and the hills with beavers did. So it's very interesting. Anyway, don't even get me started on the process of making it. I have half a notebook on it. So our takeaway is, RJ said, the more research you do, the less you have to do for later titles. Plus, come on, crawling through a subject is fun and will make you popular at parties. Oh, yeah. Maybe. Look, we covered 7 topics. We covered people, places, events, language, modern morality, criticism, and rabbit holes. Can I get a round of applause for RJ and for Jimmy? And there are 4 minutes for questions. We're going to run out of time. When we do, we're all ready to go to the hallway and answer more questions. Come on down. You win a car.
Yes. Hi.
do you guys do before starting your project versus how much do you do as you're going along?
I don't do jack shit before I start that book. I find the best way for me to research is I will pick a subject. I know, okay, in Neck Deep I'm going to be doing Egyptian archaeology. I know I'm going to need this. So the first thing I did was I picked a desert. And then I started to work on it, and I went, oh, what could I find in this desert? And that's where my research started. As I found information, the stuff that worked is going to go in the book. The stuff that doesn't gets marked as a flag. Maybe I can use this later. But I do a lot of my research as I write because I want the most accurate information I can get as I'm working on the book. I'm now 30, 40 books into my career, so I already have a very strong foundation on history. And as such, I don't have to research. But if you're not very strong on history, go learn. You learn the subjects that interest you, and then as you go along, you will find that it gets easier every time. You don't have to research before you start your book. You can just do it as you go, and then that way you know, okay, this information for this specific scene is correct. Because if you do it too much beforehand, you may not actually have the information you need, and then you have to go back to the library.
I write a series that follows a timeline, real timeline. So I have to research before I start the next book because I have to know what the next book's going to be about.
Yeah, I research ahead of time too, so I have it. So yeah, no, it's okay. Yeah, I like to know what's going on and where I'm headed. So like I said, I picked that timeline because I wanted those 3 events and I wanted to know what was coming up. So
I'm modern. You all are in the past. So because I'm modern, the research as I go works.
You call me old.
Yeah.
never happens. Okay. Anyone else? Very quickly, we have 2 minutes.
My voice is loud. Research, is it something that you automatically loved, like before you started writing, or was it that where you wanted to take your writing career caused you to be better or fall in love with the research?
I have 20 novels, no research, and I have just this one series. I just had a passion for Pompeii, and I wanted in some way to make a modern romance in ancient Pompeii. So this was a specific, just a book that I needed to write. So for me, I write modern. I write paranormal and urban fantasy and things like that. So it was just a project for me that I liked.
My other series is about a space marine, woman space marine with a bionic eye. And I did extensive research on sensors and eyes and what you see, what you feel, what you see. Heller organ, by the way, anybody know what a Heller organ is? A tick, when you're walking through the woods, a tick senses the ammonia in your sweat and starts crawling towards you as you walk toward you. So anytime you stop in the woods, just remember, all around you, there's ticks crawling. I love research.
History was the only subject in school I was actually good at. So it kind of stuck. But I liked writing, and then I liked not being wrong. And not being wrong means I have to do research. So since I just like being called out on historic fact, it naturally evolved. I need to research.